Welcome to our second webinar series for the Texas Academy for Marine Policy. I am Alyssa Schultz, the graduate director and host for this program. If you are a returning viewer, great to see you back here. If you are new to this program, welcome. The aim of this webinar series is to build off of the foundation that was laid from last year's series, where we learned about the local and federal government structure and processes, the role of science in policy as well as for policy, and how to communicate science in the policy sphere. If you missed any of these talks, no worries. You can find past webinar videos on the Texas Sea Grant YouTube channel, which is embedded on the TAMP webpage where you likely registered for this webinar. This webinar series will revolve around ocean governance policy and regulatory bodies. So today we have a fantastic speaker, Chad McGuire, who will provide an overview of ocean governance, setting the stage for following speakers to go into greater detail on some of the topics introduced today. If you have any questions or thoughts during the talk, please feel free to put them in the Q&A function that you should see at the bottom of your screen, or hang on to them at the end. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes to kind of pose questions for our speaker following the talk. So with that, let's meet our speaker. Chad McGuire is a professor of environmental policy within the Department of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth, where he's been teaching since 2008. He is currently the coordinator for the Graduate Environmental Policy program within the department and served as department chair from 2013 to 2022. He's published over 50 academic articles and 3 academic books examining the intersections of the environment, law, and policy. He works primarily on policy issues relating to climate change, coastal management, property rights, risk perception, and land use patterns. So without further ado, Professor Chad McGuire, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. I appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. And I'm very much appreciate questions. So if you have any questions or ideas or thoughts that come up, it'd be great to see that in the Q&A or in the webinar chat, but it would be great to have those at the end. So without further ado, let's start here. Let's see, make sure I'm here. So as a matter of goals for this talk, one of the things that I want to do is there's a number of talks that are going to follow this talk, I think at least three. And what I want to do is give you an overview of the governance structures and relate them to some degree to what those upcoming talks will be. So that's part of the goals. But generally speaking, the way that I think anybody with a marine science, any science background, a policy background, but certainly a non-policy or non-sort of this governance area, if a lot of you are marine policy graduates, marine science graduate students, I think it's good to know how we might look at some of these issues of governance frameworks. And generally speaking, we're looking at large body of waters in the United States. And what we're doing is we're attempting to understand the policy dynamics, what's going on there, what are humans doing there, and how is that affecting that environment? We can look at the effects from a variety of perspectives, human to human, human to environment, environment to environment, so on and so forth. But we look at that through the lens of governance frameworks. So we try to think about these dynamics through these existing human governance frameworks. And we pay special attention to the physical boundaries. So really important to establish these ideas of physical boundaries. And in marine science, of course, you identify ecosystems, you might have a basis for identifying different boundaries. You might have, you stratify the water and look at different layers of water based on salinity, based on temperature, based on opacity, light depth, etc., light penetration, photosynthesis, a number of things. Physical, chemical, biological, etc. We're looking at those physical boundaries, and we're seeing those in relationship to human-based sort of systems, jurisdictional boundaries, we'll call them. Geospatial boundaries based on human not necessarily normative, but many times just sort of this sort of happenstance, and we'll get into what that means in establishing these kinds of boundaries. And then these jurisdictional boundaries, when we understand them, when we identify them, they create the foundation for both the identification analysis and evaluation, all three of these policy issues, things that come up, things that are interesting. So we'll put that into context. First of all, in terms of an approach, we start with an understanding of what the policy picture is. So what's going on? What do we see here? And what do we think are the human elements to what we see? And once we understand that policy context, once we have that down, then we identify and examine the governance frameworks that apply to that policy area. So it's sort of like an overlay. You think about what is the issue we're dealing with, and then what are some of these sort of frameworks that are established, and how do those frameworks affect this particular issue? And within that policy picture and the governance frameworks, once they're identified and contextualized, then we can apply analytical tools, social science, et cetera. We can apply a number of different types of analytical tools we might use to think about these problems. Sometimes you have things like alternative analysis, benefit cost analysis, cost effectiveness, outcome output. There's a variety of mechanisms or sort of these analytical tools or approaches we use to try to understand whether this is, we use some normative statements. This is a good outcome, a bad outcome. It could be better and inefficient. What are the trade-offs between doing A versus B versus C? What do, not only what we see, but if we intend on doing something, what might be the effects of those intended actions, that kind of thing. A first order of business, first thing that we need to establish and understand is that in the world of marine science, for those of you that are marine scientists, you understand this very well. And those that aren't, that might be viewing just, in the sciences, especially the hard sciences, also the social sciences, but most of the social sciences, but in all of the hard sciences, generally that study, that field of study, it's centered around a methodology. And that's really important because usually the methodology is grounding, and whether it's the scientific method, as applied to a specific area of the hard sciences, the idea is that everybody is speaking essentially the same language. They're looking at the issue, relatively speaking, the same way. They're grounded in a framework that is relatively the same. In terms of governance, and I have public policy in parentheses because I think that's really what we're talking about here when we talk about governance for the most part, at least the study of governance. Generally, that's centered around a subject area. It's not necessarily centered around a methodology. You have a lot of folks with different backgrounds that have maybe specific methodologies applied to those backgrounds from different fields: economics, sociology, anthropology, political science, law, jurisprudence, you name it. They all have different sort of foundations in their own methodologies within those fields, but they're all working on these issues, social scientists, et cetera. They're all working on these issues together, and they don't necessarily share the same language. So one of the things that you have to understand, if you don't already, is that when we're talking about these issues, we're really talking about something of a subject area, and we're talking about governance and policy. And that is somewhat different because we don't necessarily speak the same language, even though the people that are studying it together. So it's a bit different, and that's important to know, especially if you're coming from a hard science background. If you're a marine scientist, for example, it's really important to understand that, because that context should help you when you see what might look like ambiguities, like, wow, this seems strange. This person looks at it this way and that way, and there's really no sort of like, I can't find a common grounding, that I normally am used to here, where we can come to, sort of this. Reasonable minds can differ, but we don't differ on the foundations. And that sort of happens. We can even differ on the foundations when we're talking about a subject area study versus a methodology, where we're not all agreeing upon that foundation. So the room for disagreement, relatively speaking, it's lower in the world of the hard sciences, especially when you have the same methodological foundation. It's a lot higher when you're looking at a subject area. And so that's important to know. As far as governance evolution, early on, in terms of the governance of the oceans, not a huge need for government intervention, historically speaking. And the reason why, of course, early on in human history, we weren't really good at getting out in the water very far. I mean, if we were getting into the water, we were really close to the coastlines for the most part. We used mostly very close coastal water, and that's even for travel. It was only later, more recent human history, that we're able to really start moving, into the oceans, into the far depths of the ocean. That's important to know because it might help you understand sort of the evolution of the governance frameworks. So if we spend most of our time on land historically, and we have a lot of use of land, we probably have a lot of rules related to the land that we use. And then as we start moving out from that land into the water, because we don't have so much of a history with that, we probably have less rules related to how we interact with what we do in the water, what we can do, sort of property rights, things like that, rules, regulations, who's interested. So that's important to know, is that, probably deeper water, as we get further and further out, there's probably less rules, and closer we get to the shore, there's probably more rules. And that has a lot to do, again, with that capacity to access and exploit ocean resources. But as time goes on, historically, coming to present day, circumstances arise. Usually there are technological advances, bigger boats, sails, etc., that create a need for intervention. So what happens is we start doing things where we start moving further and further, and it's not just moving on the water, but it's also accessing marine resources. For example, whaling history in the United States is a prime example of that. If anybody reads up on whaling history in the United States, they'll know that it really started as, wouldn't call it whaling. I mean, at least the Native Americans, it was happenstance, at least here in the East Coast and most of the country, where a whale would wash up and that body would be used. It wouldn't be hunted. It just would wash up because it was dead. Something happened to it out of their old age, etc. And it would just wash up on shore and it would be utilized. And then moving from that, European settlers identifying this, at least here on the East Coast, think of Nantucket. I'm thinking specifically sort of the whaling history here in the Northeast, where I'm from. You see it, you identify resources, and then you start thinking, well, maybe we can start utilizing those resources, capturing those whales, and that starts in the coastline, and then it starts moving further and further and further out over time, over a period of time. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is the coastline is no longer good enough because you've outfished the coastline. You need to move further offshore. We can see this in commercial fishing industries, the lobster industry, for example, in the United States, and many, many different things where we start, but the need arises as we start utilizing and overutilizing maybe, and then needing to move to new directions. And technology allows us the capacity to do that as we develop the ability to move further and further offshore. We also see this in our US history. In the Tidelands controversy and a sort of like World War II. We see a lot of technological advancement happen leading up into World War II, and certainly in World War II in the 1940s. And as a result of a lot of that advancement, we think of, sometimes there's a spike in our capacity to, utilize a lot of technology and develop a lot of new technology. War tends to be, and it can be, and historically it has been, a mechanism by which we do a lot of sort of trial and error and develop new ways of doing things and new technologies, and then we use them for non-military and non-war purposes afterwards. We find domestic applications, again non-military applications, and that certainly happened. If anybody knows about the Tidelands controversy here in the United States and in World War II, but the idea is that as our capacity to move about, and particularly think of submarines, if you think of like national defense really being developed during World War II, the capacity of them to be used and utilized, but also the capacity of ships, these ships that can now move on the seas and stay at sea for a long period of time. You think of like commercial fisheries. So now you have nations that are wanting to protect further out, protect more of their own sort of national, what they consider to be their sovereign territory, which includes waters around them. And they want to push others further away, both for defense purposes. They don't want them close to their, sneaking up on them and, attacking, but also in addition, the resources, not taking the resources that lie underneath those waters. And so we see a development of this until, in sort of the 1940s, 1950s, a real push to move further and further offshore what are our sort of what we claim as our sort of national waters, and at least in the United States, and then UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on Law on the Sea, which we'll get into in detail in another webinar. Also, I'll explain a little bit of that as well. But sort of getting these sort of common notions of what are these sort of different sort of jurisdictions, and finally the development of UNCLOS is sort of the more recent, where now it's not just any individual nations claiming certain entitlements, but it's sort of a common, where everybody is agreeing to these norms for the most part. And then you have government, in terms of governance evolution. Government often steps in and creates these rules or laws that help to define rights and sets of priorities for things it has jurisdiction over. So the idea is that, you can claim jurisdiction, you want to, and technology is usually the basis upon which you either want to do something more in the water, and also why you want to prevent others from doing more in what you consider your waters. But ultimately it's up to government, and that's the national government, making decisions usually, but also the international community. And that's where UNCLOS comes in as far as an international agreement. So generally speaking, we can look at this, and here's a simplification of what we might say are sort of these zones, these jurisdictional zones that exist, a very rough sort of, and we start with some idea of an upland, and there's this sort of demarcation point that then leads to, in most instances, this is not, different coastlines all over the world are different. They look different, but generally speaking, there's some line of vegetation that then separates that from some sort of sand, some near beach, when you have some sort of tidal influence. So you'll have some dry sand and some wet sand, and that's usually demarcated by, these sort of high tide, low tide lines. And then you'll have some section that's considered state ownership. You'll have some further section that's considered federal sea. I'm in the United States now. I'm talking specifically in the United States as far as state ownership and territorial sea. So coastal states that lie along coastlines, they have some jurisdictional rights certainly over their dry land and some of this wet land, it depends, or the wet sand, intermittent or intertidal zones, and then you also have some jurisdiction over a period of water that exists beyond that, and the federal government has some jurisdiction over water beyond that. And then, there's this territorial sea, maybe, that's a line that we have in the United States. And then we have even further jurisdiction that goes out to something called the exclusive economic zone. And then you have usually international waters. And what that looks like in terms of, this is not a very good, in terms of its resolution, might be a little hard to see, but here's a very complicated, but very good identification of what these look like. In terms of, because different states have different rules that apply. And this is from the NOAA's Office of Coast Survey, and it's been around for a while, but it's really good. It's really one of the best. And what I want to point out here is that there's a lot of variation that exists. These lines vary. They vary between states, and it's important to know and understand that because it really depends on where you are. You can see here that there is some sort of demarcation here. We see this is the high water mark usually, and they call this the mean high water. But then and that's for many states. You can see here that anything that is landward of that mean high water mark is privately owned. It's called the uplands. You probably know this or are familiar with the idea of the uplands. And then anything that is seaward of that is state owned. Generally referred to as the tidelands, and the tidelands exist from that high water mark. It's that wet sand that usually it's visible during low tide. You can walk on it and that sort of thing, but there's the separation there. And so those are usually state owned. There's a number of states that follow this rule of the mean high water mark. There's a few states, including, sure enough, because I think many of you are in Texas. Texas attributes to the mean high water mark. Those are your, sort of moon tides or king tides, or, the once or twice a year where you get a really, really, really high tide. And so what's interesting there is that makes a big difference, for example, from Massachusetts, which is where I am, which is a few states like Massachusetts actually give private ownership to the mean low watermark. And why does that matter? Well, you can think about it. This area, there's a significant difference. In Massachusetts, this area is privately owned, this area. But in Texas, for example, this area is publicly owned. So you think about an issue, for example, like climate change, you think about sea level rise, and you just think about what are the options? If this is the governance structure for Texas versus Massachusetts, what options does Texas have as far as this being public land for dealing with, approaching tides? If the water is rising, right, it can do a lot in these public land areas, whereas Massachusetts, think about it, Massachusetts, this is private land. So if government wanted to take action to be proactive about sort of limiting, say, development in these areas, it's got a tough row here in terms of protecting anything around here from here to here, because it's dealing with private land. Now you have takings, you have a lot of issues that don't necessarily exist maybe in another jurisdiction. So that's one small, quick, because we don't have all the time in the world, example of where those frameworks really matter. Understanding the sort of what's the lay of the land, how are we drawing these lines, because they help you start understanding what are the policy options. So if you were to say, well, we're going to go ahead and restrict development in this area, in Texas, that might be a viable policy option for a lot of reasons, because it's public land, it's government-owned land. But in Massachusetts, that might be really problematic as a solution. It runs into all of these sort of, potential hazards and problems. It could be very expensive to do. You might end up having to do eminent domain, and it can be quite problematic. So anyway, that's just one quick example. And then there's a bunch of other things here that are, I'm going to try to make that look easier, simpler. And here's our old one of the uplands, the vegetation, dry sand, wet sand, however that's defined in terms of public versus private, as we just saw in the previous slide. And then generally you have state waters, which is approximately 3 miles from this baseline. The baseline is usually the mean low water mark. So the state waters is approximately 3 miles. And that comes from, you think, again, this goes back to our, sciences around a methodology, maybe governance structures around a subject area. 3 miles is historically an antecedent that comes from way back when we used to have boats that shot cannons, and the cannon shot rule. Some of you might have heard this. The cannon, cannons could shoot about 3 miles at the height of those sort of naval warfare. You think of the, 1800s. But those cannons could shoot a cannonball approximately about 3 miles. So that was the idea of, hey, 3 miles is important because if 3 miles is the territorial jurisdiction for a nation at that time, right? This cannon shot rule. It's like you've got to stay. If you're not part of our, nation, if you're a flagged vessel of another nation, then you have to be at least 3 miles. That's our territorial sea. And the reason why is because you can't shoot us from there. If you're beyond 3 miles, you won't be able to hit us. So there's where, at least historically, the antecedent for the 3 miles comes from. It doesn't come from a place that makes a lot of sense, maybe, in today's parlance, but that's where it comes from originally. There are other reasons for the 3 miles, but that's now been adopted. It's not only been adopted by the United States, but UNCLOS. It's, 3 miles is 3 miles in terms of state waters. And then we have something called the territorial sea. This is just in terms of a matter of jurisdictional. Territorial sea is usually where the country, like the United States, can have a lot of defensive measures. You can't find anything, no innocent passage. No, this gets into other details. I think maybe the person talking about UNCLOS a bit might get into a little more detail, but the idea is it's for mostly defensive measures. But anyway, it's an important line because what it does is it creates a set of restrictions that are a little bit less restrictive than the state waters. And then the exclusive economic zone is that 200, it goes up to approximately 200 nautical miles, but it goes a little bit further. I have a slide that you'll see next, depending on how the sort of continental slope and how basically the geomorphology of that particular coastline. And then you have anywhere beyond approximately 200 miles or that continental, so the international sea. Which is, basically not necessarily free for all, but that's where UNCLOS, and you'll find some other rules. But generally speaking, when you see something like this and you think about governance, the governance intensity is going to be really high starting in the uplands, and then it's going to become lower and lower and lower as you move further and further out sea. So there's going to be the most kinds of rules, the most kinds of problems, the most kinds of frameworks closer to land, closer here. You have states' interest and federal interest here, for example, right? So you might have competing interests, so on and so forth, and that makes a difference. In terms of policy directions, if you think of new policies, it kind of is it's an inverse relationship, right? Because there's a lot of rules closer to land, which means there's not a lot of space for new policy, or at least those new policies have to interact with those existing rules. So you have to interact with path dependence, inertia. There are a lot of difficulties to overcome when you're closer to the water. But as you get further and further out, there's a bit more degree of freedom in terms of developing new policy directions, and that's important to know. So understanding these frameworks for that purpose alone is really helpful in a lot of ways. So here, I just wanted to show you, you can see here that, this is exactly the same. There's your baseline. It's usually some sort of agreed mean low watermark. And then you have territorial seas. The outer limit's 3 nautical miles from the baseline. You have your contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone. And then here you have so you can see the difference here is the continental shelf to the slope to the rise, and then the edge of the continental margin. So technically, if it goes beyond 200, here's 200, if it goes beyond 200 nautical miles, then that particular nation has the right to the resources, not necessarily to the navigation or things that go on here, but to the deep sea resources here. So, it's the basis for determining some of this morphology. Otherwise, if this happens before 200 miles, you're just 200 miles is where the high seas begin, international waters. And effectively, when you think about this in terms of players or actors that are involved in this process, then you can think of the 3 nautical mile. You have private interests certainly involved. You have private rights that you have to consider. You have local interests. So you have those local municipalities that are along the coastline. You have coastal state interests that are there, and you have federal interests. You'll get into the coastal and federal interests a lot, I think, in the person that's going to be talking about the Coastal Zone Management Act and some of those in a upcoming webinar. So they'll get into a lot more detail about that. But at the federal, you have mostly, generally just into the 200 nautical miles, you have a lot less actors. You usually have the federal actors, and then you'll have some private interests. And the private interests usually are how we're licensing those federal resources, commercial fishing, oil and gas exploration, wind, that sort of offshore wind, right? So that's all public land. It's federally government controlled, and the federal government engages in, it wants to use that land. It holds it under trust for the public. It's called the public trust doctrine, but it needs to think of any good trustee. It's if there are assets and the assets are held in trust for the benefit of somebody else, and that trustee has to try to get a good return for that investment, for that thing that it's holding in trust for somebody else. So the federal government often tries to utilize its lands, and the same as you think of we have national parks, we have forestry land, we have a lot of federal lands on our continent, right, in the United States proper, on land where those resources are developed and utilized. Maybe not the best, maybe not, people, again, will differ. They'll say, oh, there's oil found in this particular place. It's like, well, we don't think that oil extraction is a really good idea for these reasons. It's a resource, it's a potential resource, but it has trade-offs, it has problems with it. So maybe there's other uses that are better, or you have competing uses. You want to use an offshore resource for their viable commercial fish species, for example, and you want to go ahead and target those species, and and so you give a license, and you can do it a number of different ways, but you give private individuals an incentive to go out and capture those fish and turn them into something that's valuable that can be used in a market, and so on and so forth. But there might be other uses besides fishing in those areas that might be in competition. So there's always that. And then when you think about the high seas, it's usually just federal and international considerations, just in terms of thinking of the players that are involved. So what does this look like? Well, here's a nice coastline of Texas, a part of Texas. And I think it's probably near Galveston, but let's just look at and see if we can identify some of these things that we've already talked about quickly. So we have our upland, and generally speaking, I'm using a line of vegetation here to identify the upland. So beyond the line of vegetation, we have what we call an upland. Let's call that the line of vegetation and say there's some characteristic there that we can agree on that might be the sort of kind of vegetation that varies depending on, again, which coastline you're talking about, what it looks like. Then you have some dry sand. And you can just see here that this sand tends to get, it's a little darker because it probably gets wet a lot longer. So we're at low tide, most likely. So we have some dry sand. Then we have wet sand. And then we have, state waters. And let's call that just arbitrarily 3 miles. I don't know if it is, but one of the reasons I made that a 3-mile demarcation to move towards federal waters beyond state waters is because I saw that in the background, and that looks like an oil rig. It might not be, but if you can barely see that, that probably is an oil rig, and it probably exists just outside of the 3-mile border. And you can probably imagine why, but I'll talk about that in a little bit quickly. But if you don't have to be in state waters, then you don't have to worry about state rules, right? So it might be easier to get a permit in federal waters for federal resources without also having to go through a different permitting process and all the attendant processes in state water. So maybe you want to think about doing it, if you can, in federal water and not within that 3-mile limit state waters, because it opens up a whole nother set of principles. But then again, in Texas, that might not be an issue. I think Texas is very favorable, particularly on the Gulf, to oil and gas exploration, but you understand what I'm getting at. One of the other things that we can think about, going back to our friend there, a little not super high resolution, but telling us in terms of the different sort of framework lines there, is we can think about Texas. So Texas, so we understand the dry sand is there, but what's that mean high watermark? Well, it's probably not here. As you can see here, we have some, seaweed that's partially buried, because that's telling me that there are tides. This is probably the norm for the tides, the average tide. But then when you get that full moon, or you get that king tide, when all the planets align, so to speak, right, you'll get that strong tide. And that looks like that, maybe. So what's interesting is that you have Texas, this is probably, so this is all probably public land. If this is, then this is in Texas. And then just for juxtaposition, if this was Massachusetts, this would be the demarcation. This is all private land. So, private land here to Texas, let's say, and then if this was Massachusetts and some other states, private land all the way down to there. It can be privately owned. So again, just to give us an example of what would that mean in terms of possibilities. We saw that looked like a very natural very natural coastline, undisturbed for the most part by humans. This is Texas, Galveston, Texas, and we can tell that humans have had an impact and an influence going back a while on what the coastline looks like, those sort of attributes, and whether they exist or not. And that's maybe more of what it looks like today. But if we try to see those lines, what those lines look like, they're a little bit skewed because we've put things along that coastline, and that probably provides an upper limit. And so this gives us a good chance to start looking at 3 different examples, one at the coast, one in waters and one in international. So let's look at this coastal example to try to think about how these sort of governance structures, these regulatory lines there, how they might make a difference. Now, this is Massachusetts, coastal Massachusetts, near to where I am. And this is an area that doesn't have a lot of development. It's along a coastline, an inner bay, runs out into a bay. And we can see some, obviously not a lot of disturbance here. And there's another, you can see salt marshes. And this is what you would probably say, for the most part, is what you would expect to see without a lot of human influence, sort of this kind of thing of where you'd see a salt marsh and you see tidal ranges and that sort of thing. And you have marsh flats and you have, important grasses, et cetera, and everything like that. And so we understand that, and we understand that it hosts these kinds of ecosystems host a number of natural organisms, an entire sort of, biome, and a rich sort of, sense of diversity in terms of the different sort of everything that's going on there. And then we can think about, well, again, this is Massachusetts. What happens when we have, human interaction? We can still see an estuary here, for example, and parts of a salt marsh. There's a little bit of a dump there, but we can see a lot of development, a lot of human interaction there. And one of the first things we can say is, well, where's that Massachusetts separation line? And that's probably somewhere around there. That's probably the mean low water mark. So a lot of development, pretty easy to be done in this area because that's all private. One of the consequences of having, private property extend all the way to the mean low water mark is that it's easier for, private development, generally speaking, at least historically. And so we can look at this, another view, something slightly different, and we could say that's probably something around where Massachusetts calls the demarcation between private and public rights. Maybe, Texas would be something more like that. Maybe that's where Texas's line, the red, would be. Either way, we have some development. And then what we have to ask ourselves is, what happens when we have these kinds of developments and things change? And one of the things that changes is you can have a lot of development in these areas, and you saw the seawall, and there's a reason that there's a seawall there, and you can see the seawall here. And one of the problems is that when you have a good storm accompanied with sea level rise, and you have a strong storm surge, and we have a sort of a cyclical pattern here, nor'easter is a counter-cyclical, goes counterclockwise, you can get a really strong buildup of a storm surge. And then you have things like this that can happen. And it creates problems. Now we have a problem in terms of understanding, so it's interesting to try to think about, well, what could have been done or might have been done in Massachusetts, or is this the best use of the land in Massachusetts? And obviously in this instance, it doesn't look like that. It doesn't look like a very good use. When we think about that, though, we see what we see today. And the only thing I want to bring up is, one of the things that we can think about is, hey, here's another view of a similar type of development in this sort of coastal development. You can see here, there's sort of sort of salt marsh, that sort of thing. When they developed this is part of the push after World War II, where you had a lot of people moving out of the cities. In the 1950s, that's where the high water mark, the mean high water mark was in the 1950s. That's where it existed. And then in 2008, it was here. So one of the things we can say is that, it might have seemed okay to build and develop this in the 1950s. Not only would we didn't have a lot of knowledge of climate change and sea level rise at that time, that really wasn't in the common parlance, but also, the seas were where they were. So the high tide was further out to sea. It doesn't look so good today. And that's, again, this 2008, it's even further now. But so again, one of the things that we often do is we look at what is, and we try to understand it in sort of a framework of, well, does that make sense? Well, it might not make sense today, but historically, did it make sense? So there's this sort of temporal component to all of these governance structures that we have to consider. There's a lot of things that we have to consider in terms of what has been done, what we know now, and then what are our options at this stage? We can't go back, right? We can't go back in time, but what are our options relative to those types of things? In terms of offshore resource, An offshore resource example I wanted to point out is something that's happening right now. So this is the city of New Bedford, again in Massachusetts, what I know, South Coast. It's the largest commercial, in terms of dollar value, commercial fisheries landing port in the United States. So more money from fisheries comes into New Bedford Harbor than anywhere else in the United States, including Alaska. So it does a lot of fishing. It does a lot of commercial fishing. And there's an example that's just filled with all of its boats there, ready to go out and do its thing. And that's a use of what they do is they get a license from the federal government to go out into federal waters, right? And to fish those federal waters, which are those fish until they're captured are public property. The moment that they capture, they transform. It's as long as you have the permit to do it. And that permit allows you to catch that particular fish and the particular quantities it transmutes. The property right transmutes. It's fascinating, from a public property into a private property once it's captured. But again, they have a license to do that that's granted by the federal government. They don't have the private right to do it. They have a right through the federal government acting as trustee on behalf of us. But anyway, that's one use that's happening with the waters. Recently in New Bedford, it's also become the staging ground for the first major federal offshore wind project. And this is all of a week ago. We're talking about the first, about 2 weeks ago now. The first wind turbines. This is in New Bedford Harbor. And it's hard to see, but all of those fishing vessels are back here. And they have a big staging ground for a massive offshore wind farm. And these things are massive. They're absolutely massive. And this is a different use, and it's different from oil and gas. We don't have much oil and gas in our federal waters. We have none, as far as I know, in the Northeast in terms of federal waters. Exploration, we haven't permitted any of that, but we've permitted for a lot of offshore wind in federal waters, and this is the first big one going in. It's going to provide enough electricity for about 500,000 homes, approximately 400 to 500,000 homes. And so this is just examples of these very large things and there it is being towed out of New Bedford Harbor, and there's the hurricane barrier, but being towed out, and they're just absolutely massive. And then that's the structure that will actually go out there and drill those. I'll put all the two components together and then put all of the pieces together. It's an amazing, fascinating thing to see because of its scale, but it's a competing use. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up, there's a couple of things that we think about offshore use of resources. The first thing is we can see here's the siting plans for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM. And this is sort of where sites are currently being identified. So here are sites being identified here off the coast of Massachusetts. It has a lot of wind. It's really 365, 24/7. It is really windy out there. And then we have the mid-Atlantic. You have a number of sites for offshore wind. There's all going down the mid-Atlantic and then into the south here, South Carolina. One thing I wanted to point out is it's hard to see here. They have something called the federal state boundary. That's the 3-mile limit. That's what they're talking about with the federal state boundary. And I'll just increase it a little bit for you. And none of you should be surprised that all of these projects are permitted outside of state waters. There's a reason for that. If anybody's ever heard of Cape Wind was attempted to happen here, technically in federal water, but in this sort of area that was right along in between Martha's Vineyard here, Nantucket, and the Cape, and right in this area. And it intersected slightly with state waters, and it never really happened for a lot of reasons. There was a lot of resistance, and some for some logical reasons and a lot for illogical reasons. Again, methodology, right? We're talking about a subject area. So a lot of, rationalizations rather than rational thinking maybe sometimes. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that where are people looking to do these sort of leases? And these are federal leases, so it's no surprise they're in federal water, but you see that they're all located, all of the proposed projects, all of them are located in federal water and outside of state water. And there's a reason for that. And the only other thing is, one of the reasons I didn't do the alphabet soup in terms of governance, like who's involved at the federal level, is because everybody is, almost every department is, So we're talking about, in this case, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is the Department of the Interior. It's, the Department of the Interior isn't, the interior of the country. But so a lot of people wouldn't think that the oceans are part of the interior, but almost every department is involved, which means tons of federal agencies within each of those departments. You can imagine it runs the gamut. So in terms of one of the other things I wanted to point out is that even though all of these are, scheduled to be outside of 3 miles, they need to have transmission lines. So even though the site itself will be outside of 3 miles, for these proposed farms. They have transmission lines that certainly go into, you have New York, you have, Rhode Island, you have Connecticut, and Massachusetts. So you have these transmissions that'll be underground. So obviously states are involved because now you're into state waters, right? You're getting through. So there's no free lunch here. There's a lot of process and permitting. You might cite the actual, farm itself outside of just in federal jurisdiction, but there's always going to be state interactions. And those that watch the coastal zone come back for the coastal zone management will probably learn about a little bit of that, a little bit of the sort of rules involved in coastal management and how states have a lot of rights given to them by developing coastal management plans and those sort of things. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out because I think it's important. Finally speaking, we have UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. It's an international agreement. I think somebody's going to be talking about it a bit more, at least in terms of the Deep Seabed Authority, which they work for. And so here I just wanted to identify that we have other issues that can be involved. So for example, fisheries, I mentioned commercial fisheries like New Bedford, right? You can have fisheries that extend from the exclusive economic zone, straddle the exclusive economic zone into international waters. And not only can you have nations, like, so for example, the United States and Canada, or the United States and Mexico, that can share borders and therefore share, near coastal waters and, territorial waters, state waters, et cetera, exclusive economic zones and international waters. You also have other nations that can sort of come in. They can, through international waters, come to the edge of your zone. We've had examples of this. For example, fish, they know nothing of these boundaries. And you have transboundary species, fish that move between boundaries, and they move great distances, and they're commercially viable. They're target species, so we want them. And so, for example, you might have a hatchery and you might have a development ground that's within the exclusive economic zone, and you have a fish that's, a fish species that you're trying to protect, so you're not allowing for fishing. But those fish then, even though you're not fishing them, they might move out of your zone and move into international waters. So you might have a flagged vessel from Nation C sitting right here just waiting for those fish, even though you're not fishing them. You would love to, but you can't because you're trying to reestablish the population to a viable, sustainable level. It moves over into international waters. You have Nation C. It's a problem. And so there are all of these sort of interesting sort of examples where this happens. And that's why international, not just UNCLOS, which is a multilateral agreement, but you have bilateral agreements between nations where, hey, don't come and do this, and we won't come and do it to you, sort of that sort of thing, where you try to have all of these opportunities to get together to think about that. There's other things besides fishing, of course. There's marine mammals, for example. In the United States, we have the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So what's fascinating about that is it protects marine mammals in our waters. It does not protect them necessarily when they're in international waters from other countries' actions. It does protect them from a U.S. flagged vessel that's in international waters. One of the things that's interesting about our laws is that they apply to you even when you leave. So if you're a vessel that leaves U.S. jurisdiction into international waters, if you're flagged in the United States, you're a United States vessel, all of those U.S. laws still apply to you. So, for example, there's that, but also there's difficulties in the protection of certain species, whether it's trying to protect the species or it's trying to, hold on to the species for yourself. There's always these difficulties in terms of how these frameworks play out. And then we also have deep sea valuables. And the deep sea valuables are interesting. One of the most recent are these, they're not recent, but again, our capacity, our technology is increasing and it's getting economically viable for us to now move into, let's say, international waters and to be able to go down and harvest some of these things like polymetallic nodules. These are these sort of aggregates of important rare earths like manganese, cobalt, copper, and nickel. And these are, they're used in all kinds of neat things that we like today. Our technologies, we have a lot of advancement in electric vehicles, for example, and, we're electrifying so many things and we need these rare earth metals. And this is one area where there's a lot of deposits. There's a lot of, and historically could never touch them. They're just down too deep. We don't have the technology for it. But more recently, we're developing the technology. So you're going to see, I know for sure, and if you go to the deep seabed talk, I think in 2 or 3 webinars from now, you'll probably get a good understanding of what this is as an issue, as a problem, what happens when advanced nations that have the technological capacity try to run to international waters and harvest the goods and resources of those waters ahead of other countries that haven't yet developed or don't have the economic capacity to do the same thing. So what are the important rules that come out of that? So that's really fascinating and interesting. And again, it comes back to our governance structure where there's less rules the further we move offshore, and sometimes that can be good, and sometimes that can be really problematic. As far as final thoughts, so again, just want to reiterate, we start with an understanding of the ocean and coastal issues, that policy context. What's the issue? What's the problem? And then we understand the governance frameworks and overlay them onto the policy issue to try to contextualize them, to give them sort of life and understanding. What are we really getting at here? And what are really some of the trade-off issues, the issues that we really can have, discussions on? And then identify and use analytical tools to begin to understand and assess the relationship between policy context and governance frameworks. That's really what it's all about. That's sort of the process. And when we talk about an introduction to governance from this policy perspective. And then finally, comprehend how those frameworks affect policy directions, both existing and potential directions. And that's it. So thank you very much. I think we're pretty much on time.
Great. Thank you, Chad. That was fantastic. I definitely learned a lot, and we have about 10 to 13 minutes for questions. So if any of you have any questions, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A. I think it's on the bottom of your screen. Or you can raise your hand and we can potentially unmute you. But I can go ahead and get us started. Hold on. With a question to get the ball rolling. So, Chad, what do you think works well in the current process for drafting and updating legislation based on new information or research? You kind of had a section about the evolution of ocean governance. So with that in mind, and then what do you think could use improvement?
Yeah, so you're talking about legislation, developing and drafting new laws and rules related to ocean governance. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is a slow and agonizing process, I would say. So I think if anybody read the history of UNCLOS, for example, that international agreements are always hard, usually because you have a lot of state players. I'm just thinking internationally, I can move to national, but just internationally speaking, it's always very difficult. And what you end up coming out with, UNCLOS is somewhat of a rarity because you have a lot of agreement on some very specific things between nations. And at the end of the day, nations don't have to agree on anything, right? That's what makes international agreements so difficult, is that nation is a sovereign and it simply just can say no. And technically, the United States, we are a signatory to UNCLOS. We signed it, but we never ratified it here. We have to have our Congress ratify it. So we agree to what goes on in UNCLOS, but we actually aren't a fully fledged member of UNCLOS, a fully signed. Again, we signed it as a nation a while ago, but we've never ratified it in our Congress. Our Senate's never ratified it. So that's one example where, again, we follow the rules, but we don't really have to, and many nations don't. And one of the issues that comes up is the International Seabed Authority, for example, those nations that want to go out and start harvesting in international waters. Who can stop them? Even if they are a signatory necessarily to UNCLOS, maybe they're not in agreement with any new proposed rules and regulations related to the harvesting or the use of those international waters and the resources that exist in international waters. This happens a lot with countries, with fishing, most particularly going fishing in international waters in ways that are harmful and basically unsustainable fishing. But coming further to the coastline, it is really hard to move those existing policies that we have in place for a variety of reasons. The political process it's just a process. I mean, all of us know, we've had some experience with it. It is not, what is it? I'm thinking of cognitive dissonance, we're rationalizing beings, not rational beings. That's the big insight of humans. We think we're rational beings. That's that. What is it? Homo rationalis, or the Homo economics. The economists think all humans act rationally and make perfectly rational decisions, and we're quite the opposite. We often make very irrational decisions, relatively speaking, from a third-party perspective. But we can rationalize our decisions. We can make sense out of them after the fact. And the political process is very much like that. It's with a lot of actors, with a lot of different interests. You can make a difference usually when you do. In most policy parlance, it's usually done in an incremental way. So there's usually not huge, big changes. Like we've seen big changes happen recently overturning of big, significant sort of ways of thinking policies, existing policies that weren't. So I'm thinking of Roe versus Wade. So most are affirmative action. They've come from the U.S. Supreme Court. They haven't come from Congress. We've never had a congressional law, a federal law related to the right to abortion. And that's one of the reasons it was relatively easy to undo, because that's such a big lift, apparently, at the federal level. It's just such a big lift to do. So we've always allowed this sort of implicit constitutional right to exist that the U.S. Supreme Court overturned. My point in saying that is most of the big policy moves we've seen recently over the past 5 years or so have been from the judicial branch, not from the legislative branch or the executive branch. Very hard to do when we get closer to shore and there's all of that sort of stuff going on.
Great. Thank you for that very elaborate answer. We do have a question in the Q&A from Paul saying, is it true that Texas state limits is 3 leagues or about 9 miles?
Yeah, so Texas is, there's a couple of states, and I believe, and I'm not an expert on Texas, but yes, I remember this. There's a couple of states, and it's the Gulf. So being in the Gulf of Mexico, because Mexico's jurisdiction as well, it's shared, right? So there's the Gulf. The Gulf of Mexico has some unique characteristics to it for a variety of reasons in terms of sharing it with another nation and it being a Gulf, not a huge like the Atlantic or Pacific, a big ocean. Yeah, I think Texas has. I think it is 9 miles. It has jurisdiction over, and so and Texas again. Yes. So that would have been 9 miles, but I'm sure that, Texas is very has been historically pro to offshore oil and gas development with its resources, as Alaska tends to be as well. So that, that oil rig was probably definitely within 9 miles per my example there. Yeah. But some states, there are some variation, just like we showed the variation with what is the difference between, state-owned lands, that sort of wetland, the intertidal zone versus, uplands, that kind of thing. It's only a couple. Most of it's 3 miles for almost every state. Every coastal state is 3 miles.
Awesome. Does anyone else have a question? Our Q&A is currently empty. Feel free to raise your hand or put a question in there. I will give you a minute. Or I have another question, actually. How are science expert opinions incorporated or solicited when legislation is drafted? And do you think it's effective at this point in time?
Yeah, so that, it's important. It's incredibly important. It mostly happens, I think it has most effect at the regulatory stage. So in the record, so there's a legislative record, usually the Federal Register. So at the federal level and in most states, when you propose a bill, there's an argument on the floor, and usually that argument's recorded. And it's really important what information gets into that argument, because it helps you understand the reasons for the creation of that legislation. Usually the writing of the legislation is generally poor. It usually doesn't have very good definitions on this is why we enacted this law, this is what it's intended to do, here are the assumptions. So to get to that, if you were ever to sort of be in court challenging that law, it's really important to have sort of this information, and scientific information is incredibly important when we're talking about many of the things, the reasons we're choosing to do something. Most of the time, it doesn't happen so much in the legislation that we pass. It happens a lot in the enactment of that legislation through agency rulemaking. So a lot of times we deal with agencies. Fisheries is probably a good example. Every year or a few years, they're always setting the regional councils by a federal law, Magnuson-Stevenson, a federal law, they're given a responsibility for figuring out what is a maximum yield how can the fishery operate? How much should we, take of any individual species, et cetera, et cetera. And the science in that is incredibly important in that process of figuring it out. It is vital. But that's a regulatory process, not a legislative process. They seem like they're the same thing, but they're slightly different. And science plays a huge role in the environmental world, not just in marine, but in all environmental, when we're talking about regulations, when we're talking about doing things like NEPA reviews, National Environmental Policy Act, environmental impact statements, that kind of thing. It plays a critical role in the development of what's called the record, and that record then establishes the basis upon which decisions are made. And whenever you're going to challenge, say it's a bad decision, you say the decision goes against the principles of the law, it's that record that helps you establish the evidence of whether or not it's a good or bad decision, if that makes sense. So that science is critical to get in there, without a doubt.
Great. We have about 4 more minutes until we have to close it out. So if there are any lingering questions or thoughts in any of your minds, please feel free. Otherwise, I will keep going.
While we're waiting for a question, one thing I can add to the first question you had is one of the reasons it's difficult for legislation to move and change is for the reason I said at the beginning, is because we're talking about so many different interests, so many people that come at the issue from so many different perspectives, and the effects that changes have. It's the constant in life, but it's also the scariest thing, I think, for humans, is the idea that something's going to be different than it was today. And so whenever we're proposing something that changes behavior patterns, changes expectations, it is, it's usually, it's a fraught process. It happens, but it doesn't happen usually like that. If you, one thing from science that's borrowed in policy recently is punctuated equilibrium theory. If you remember, if anybody's ever dealt with that, usually see in the geologic record, it's usually when we see mass extinction die-offs, you see a set, an ecosystem, and you have a set of population of species, and then all of a sudden there's a big die-off, but then it's a new equilibrium is established. We have dinosaurs, and then we have mammals, and so mammal, it's a new equilibrium state. And you can't see this. There's usually not a lot of pre-evidence to show you that you're moving from one state to the other. And that's the idea behind punctuated equilibrium. Sometimes legislation and policy moves in this direction. You don't see something happening in terms of a change for a very long period of time. It's all behind the scenes, and it's very small and incremental. And then all of a sudden, within a few months to a year, there's significant change. And when you look at that over the period of decades, you're like, wow, that was incredible. I could never have guessed that we'd have that level of change in such a short period of time. But we've noticed that. We've noticed that policy does follow often these punctuated events. We just can't forecast them very well. So as much as I want to say it's hard to change, when change happens, sometimes it can change. It can happen very quickly.
Great. We have one last question from the Q&A. What are some examples of jobs that we as marine scientists can pursue to make a positive impact on marine policy and protection?
Everything. I would say everything. Any and every area. That's why the whole idea behind talking to marine scientists about governance and sort of frameworks, because fundamentally, I have a background, both an undergraduate and graduate degree in environmental science, and so I have I have a love for the sciences and the methodologies that apply, and it's incredibly important. I also went to law school, and it's incredibly important to have that knowledge base, especially if you're thinking about marine policy issues, because, like I said before, that knowledge base is the foundation upon which those decisions are made. It's kind of like getting everybody to understand the things that they don't understand as a foundation to start making decisions. People want to make good decisions. They want to make positive decisions. They want to be thought of. Usually it's the, well, what is the good decision? Okay, I'll do that because you said it's the good decision. And I agree with it. Helping them understand why it's a good decision, helping decision makers, being a decision maker, helping other decision makers understand. And that marine science background is invaluable. We have, I mentioned this, Alyssa, a while back. We have our School for Marine Science and Technology, and I work with those students a lot. They're all graduate students for the most part, and they're all getting the same marine science PhDs, and they're all doing the same kind of work, really good work. And they get really involved in the policy aspects of it. Some of them have, and they've had profound effects in fisheries management, most particularly that I know of. But also we have some coastal zone managers that have marine science backgrounds that are the best coastal zone managers that I've ever met. That background is incredibly valuable if you want to move it into the sort of the human dynamic scene and not just stick with the hard sciences. It's incredibly valuable. Yeah.
Great. Well, that is all the time we have today. Thank you, Chad, for being here and giving a great talk and answering great questions. And thank you to all of the attendees for either coming back or joining us for the first time. I really appreciate all of you.
Okay, thank you.